Imagine a family walking into a supermarket today carrying the exact same paycheck and buying the exact same items they did a year ago: bread, cereal, detergent, medicine, vegetables, diapers, and maybe a small cut of meat if the budget allows. Nothing luxurious. No major changes in their lifestyle. Yet, when the cashier calls out the total, the number is higher once again. This family might never fully understand why. Months ago, the fertilizer used to grow the wheat became more expensive. The plastic wrapping the bread depended on a petrochemical supply chain that stalled thousands of miles away. Rising diesel prices pushed up the cost of trucking that food from farms to warehouses, and from warehouses to store shelves. A strategic maritime shipping route became dangerous, causing transport insurance to skyrocket. Meanwhile, the retail chain had to pay higher interest rates just to finance its inventory. On their own, each of these cost increases is tiny enough to disappear inside the system. But together, they quietly chip away at that family's hard-earned paycheck. Globalization used to make world prices feel entirely local. Now that it's beginning to unravel, it's revealing just how global those prices have always been. Welcome to Epoch of Money. This is where money, power, and history intersect, and where nothing is ever as simple as it seems. For decades, globalization acted like an invisible discount code supporting the Western world's standard of living. Companies could manufacture goods wherever labor, land, energy, and raw materials were cheapest, then move those products across oceans at an unprecedented scale. A single shirt might be designed in Europe, stitched in Bangladesh, dyed with chemicals from China, shipped under a foreign flag, and finally sold at a mall in Canada or the United States. All the consumer ever saw was the finished product and the price tag. And for a long time, that price kept falling. TVs got bigger and cheaper. Computers became exponentially more powerful while getting more affordable. Clothes became so inexpensive, people started treating them as disposable. Furniture, toys, appliances, phones, tools, items that once required months of savings turned into routine weekend purchases. Even when wages didn't grow quickly, cheaper manufactured goods made people feel wealthier than they actually were. And that benefit was real. Globalization lifted the living standards of millions, putting items previous generations considered luxuries within reach of ordinary households. It helped developing nations build factories, create jobs, and join global markets, while giving companies access to specialized skills worldwide. But that invisible discount came with strict fine print that never showed up on the receipt. Fuel had to stay cheap, ships had to arrive on schedule, ports had to stay open, exporting nations had to keep shipping, trade relationships had to stay stable, exchange rates couldn't fluctuate wildly, sea lanes had to stay safe, and companies had to trust that the cheapest factory today would still be operating tomorrow. Products look cheap only because the cost of peace, cheap energy, smooth shipping, and international political cooperation was treated as if it were completely free. An entire generation grew up believing these low prices were normal, but they weren't. They were the product of a very specific, hyper-cooperative chapter in economic history. That system could handle an occasional recession, a regional war, or a political crisis because the rest of the world kept turning smoothly. But then, the shocks started hitting faster and harder. A global pandemic shut down factories and ports. A massive container ship blocked the Suez Canal. A semiconductor shortage stalled car and electronics manufacturing worldwide. Russia's invasion of Ukraine sent energy, grain, and fertilizer markets into a tailspin. Trade disputes brought tariffs and export restrictions. Attacks on cargo ships forced vessels to take much longer routes around entire continents. And then, conflict made the Strait of Hormuz one of the most dangerous choke points in the global economy. For months, that narrow strip of water between Iran and Oman became a critical bottleneck for energy, agriculture, manufacturing, medicine, and shipping. Naturally, oil grabbed the headlines. The Strait of Hormuz is the world's most vital transit route for traded oil, so prices reacted instantly. Investors obsessively tracked tanker movements, military developments, ceasefire talks, and strategic petroleum reserves. Fertilizer is baked into the cost of your bread, cereal, vegetables, cooking oil, meat, eggs, and dairy. Petrochemicals are hidden inside food packaging, detergent bottles, clothing, sofa foam, carpets, paint, insulation, electronics, car parts, medical supplies, and building materials. In fact, the item that causes the biggest shortage in your life might be something you've never directly purchased yourself. This is how a global shock actually hits home. It rarely moves in a straight line, it ripples out in layers. A trade route becomes dangerous. Insurance companies charge higher premiums. Tankers wait, reroute, or pause sailings altogether. Transport costs climb. Importers pay more. Factories pay more for raw materials. Farmers spend more on fertilizer. Manufacturers face higher costs for parts and packaging. Wholesalers raise their prices. And finally, retailers trim discounts, shrink package sizes, tweak formulas, or simply raise the sticker price. By the time the bill reaches you at the register, the original spark is almost completely invisible. Inflation doesn't happen all at once. It's the result of thousands of businesses quietly passing their rising costs down the line. That's why it's so misleading when a crisis seems to end on the news. Oil prices can plummet quickly because financial markets react in real time. A treaty is signed, tanker traffic resumes, producers step up output, and investors decide the worst is over. Headline news declares the crisis resolved. But farms and factories don't run at the speed of financial markets. A farmer buys fertilizer long before planting season. If it's scarce or overpriced, they might use less, plant fewer acres, switch crops, or just absorb the higher cost. The harvest doesn't come until months later. Then that grain has to be milled into flour, which becomes bread, animal feed, cooking oil, meat, and packaged foods. The actual crisis might be completely over, yet its financial aftershocks are only just arriving at your local grocery store. Financial markets react today. Food markets react next season. You don't eat fertilizer, but its price is embedded in almost everything on your plate. The same lag applies to petrochemicals. A packaging company might have months of inventory on hand. An automaker might still be working through existing stocks. A hospital might have secured its helium through a long-term contract. For a while, things look normal because companies are consuming what they already owned. Then those contracts expire, inventories dry up, new shipments arrive at higher prices, and those costs leak into the next production cycle. Even after the headline crisis vanishes, the real cost to your household is just getting started. And sometimes that cost doesn't show up as a higher price tag at all. Companies have plenty of subtle ways to pass costs on to you. They can raise the sticker price, they can shrink the package size, they can lower the quality of ingredients, they can strip away features or shorten warranties, or they can add new service fees and cut back on customer support. The cereal box stays the same height, but it gets noticeably thinner. A bottle of detergent gives you fewer loads. A restaurant keeps its prices steady, but trims the portion sizes. An airline unbundles a service that used to be free and charges extra for it. A manufacturer replaces a durable component with a cheaper alternative. In short, you don't always pay more money. Sometimes you just get less value for the exact same cash. This matters because the era of peak globalization didn't just lower prices. It trained consumers to expect endless abundance. Store shelves were always overflowing, deliveries kept getting faster, and inventory felt bottomless. If one brand ran out, another instantly took its place. We stopped asking where things came from because the system worked so seamlessly it became invisible. But that abundance was built on a hyper-lean supply structure. The world didn't keep 5 redundant suppliers for every critical material. Companies naturally chose the absolute cheapest and most efficient vendor. They avoided keeping extra stock in warehouses because stored inventory ties up cash. They saw backup capacity as an unnecessary expense, designing systems on the assumption that parts would arrive just in time. In good times, this setup drove prices down to rock bottom, but it relied entirely on the assumption that good times would last forever. Building resilience back into the system isn't free. Bringing production back home means paying higher wages, buying pricier land, adhering to stricter environmental laws, keeping larger safety stocks, and building duplicate factories. Governments can subsidize new facilities, protect strategic industries, and incentivize companies to hold backup capacity. But every single one of those moves carries a price tag. It shows up in your taxes, in national debt, in higher shelf prices, or in lower corporate earnings. More often than not, it's a mix of all four. The old system kept goods cheap while hiding its fragility. The new system might be far safer, but its security comes with a very visible price tag. This is where political promises get tricky. Leaders love to pledge that they'll bring factories back, penalize foreign competitors, and eliminate reliance on global supply chains overnight. But a tariff alone doesn't build a factory. It simply makes imported goods more expensive. Building industrial capacity takes engineers, skilled labor, power grids, local suppliers, specialized machinery, transport infrastructure, financing, and decades of accumulated know-how. Tariffs can certainly help protect strategic industries, but in the short term, they mostly just raise the cost of imported products and components. A company facing new tariffs might absorb a fraction of that cost out of its profit margins, but margins only stretch so far. Eventually, part of that bill gets passed down to you. You can't rebuild industrial infrastructure overnight, but you can make imports more expensive in a heartbeat. That's why the transition is so painful. The old cheap system loses its reliability before the new. Domestic system becomes fully productive. Households end up squeezed from both sides. Global supply disruptions push prices up, while the cost of trying to become self-reliant pushes them up even further. Then enter interest rates. When a supply shock drives up the cost of energy, food, shipping, and manufactured goods, central banks worry these price hikes will leak into the broader economy. To stop inflation from becoming permanent, they delay rate cuts or keep interest rates higher for longer. But higher interest rates don't produce fertilizer. They don't open shipping lanes, repair refineries, or boost helium output. All they do is make borrowing expensive in order to cool down consumer demand. So households get taxed twice. First, the supply shock makes groceries, fuel, and daily necessities pricier. Then, the fight against inflation makes mortgages, credit cards, auto loans, and business financing far more expensive. The initial crisis raises the bill, and the response to the crisis raises the interest on the money you need to pay that bill. This is why global supply shocks feel so brutal. You aren't just paying more at the supermarket. Owning a home, upgrading a car, or keeping a small business afloat suddenly costs significantly more too. And this burden is never shared equally. A wealthy family can delay a vacation, cut back on luxuries, absorb higher utility bills, or draw from savings. But a lower income family already spends the vast majority of its income on non-negotiable essentials: food, shelter, electricity, and transportation. You can't negotiate with hunger, you can't delay winter, you can't pause your commute to work. When food inflation spikes, everyone pays more. But for families living paycheck to paycheck, what gets lost isn't just money, it's their freedom to choose. This explains why falling inflation rarely feels like relief. Inflation measures how fast prices are rising, not the absolute price level itself. If your grocery bill jumps from $100 to $120 and then slowly edges up to $122, inflation has officially dropped, but your bill hasn't. Lower inflation doesn't mean prices are going back down. It just means they are climbing at a slower pace. Across most developed economies, even as inflation rates cooled, food and energy prices remained far higher than pre-pandemic levels. Prices didn't reset, they just started rising more slowly from a much higher baseline. The cost of living crisis doesn't magically disappear when the charts look better. It stays embedded in the monthly family budget. That's the real danger of ending the cheap globalization era. For decades, low-cost imports helped offset stagnant wage growth. A worker might not have received a massive raise, but TVs, clothes, tech, and housewares were constantly getting cheaper or offering far better quality for the same price. Globalization boosted real purchasing power without requiring massive wage hikes. If that invisible discount vanishes while wages remain under pressure, households get hit from both directions. Does this mean globalization is dead? Not at all. Goods will keep crossing borders. Companies will continue using international supply networks. Countries will still specialize, trade, and depend on one another. The world isn't collapsing back into completely isolated national economies. Total self-sufficiency is inefficient, insanely expensive, and in most cases, physically impossible. What's changing is the nature of globalization. Supply chains will now be heavily shaped by political strategy. Companies will shift production toward allied nations. Governments will subsidize strategic sectors. Businesses will hold larger inventories and build regional redundancy into their operations. Tariffs and export limits will become routine tools. Energy, minerals, food, technology, and transport will be treated less like neutral market commodities and more like pillars of national security. We will still live in a globalized world, but it will be a less optimized, more redundant, highly political, and notably more expensive version of it. Globalization isn't disappearing. It's just losing its innocence. For years, everyday consumers were told that the low price on a store shelf was pure proof of economic efficiency. But that price never factored in the cost of rebuilding a lost factory, securing a critical maritime trade route, or maintaining strategic reserves for when oil flows stall. It ignored the risk of relying on a single nation for essential medicines or key industrial components. Nor did it reflect the environmental strain or political instability on the other end of the chain. The shelf price was real, it was simply incomplete. Now those omitted costs are coming back home, as higher prices, elevated taxes, government subsidies, periodic shortages, rising national debt, and sustained interest rates. Because these costs hit us individually, few people realize they are all line items on the exact same bill. A spike in grocery costs seems completely disconnected from a naval dispute across the globe. High mortgage rates feel unrelated to a shortage of fertilizer. A shrinking bottle of detergent looks completely detached from natural gas disruptions. A government grant for a semiconductor plant feels like it has nothing to do with the price of your next smartphone. Yet, they are all chapters of the exact same story. For decades, globalization made people feel wealthier by keeping the things they bought remarkably cheap. That entire arrangement rested on cheap energy, low-cost shipping. Those conditions were never guaranteed. We just assumed they were permanent. Now, disruptions are hitting more frequently, system buffers are paper thin, and costs are traveling all the way from distant factories, farms, ports, and ocean channels straight into family budgets. The era of cheap goods didn't end because the world stopped making things. It ended because the invisible conditions that kept those things cheap are finally making themselves seen. And when that final bill arrives, the corporations that design the system aren't the ones paying it. It's paid by the ordinary person standing at the checkout line, wondering why the exact same basket of groceries costs more once again. If this video gave you a new perspective on how the global economy touches your daily life, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. History holds the answers. And right here at Epoch of Money, I'll keep showing you where to find them.